What was life of medieval Nalanda and Oxford student like? The two most premier institutions of the medieval world. How tough were their entrance exams? How much fees was expected? What subjects did they study? What was their campus like and their classrooms? What food did they eat? How many teachers did they have? What did they play? Did they get any punishments and how strict were they? Once they graduated, what was their job prospects like? And most importantly, which institute was the better of the two? To know all of these answers, let's rewind our clocks a few hundred years back and step into the lives of Devdatta and John as they chart their way into their dream universities, Nalanda and Oxford. Devdatta was born in the capital city of Kannauj along the banks of the river Ganga in the 7th century. As a child, he was very curious and loved listening to stories of the great scholars of the University of Takshashila. Vishnugupta Chanakya, Panini, Patanjali, Charaka, and the list was endless. Before going to bed, when his mother spoke about the ancient princes of the modern empire, he imagined himself a prince on his way to the legendary houses of the great teachers of Takshashila. But at the end of every story, he couldn't bring himself to smile. For at the end of every story, there was the destruction of the great university by the barbaric white Huns. He disliked them with a passion. He could picture them burning the great libraries of the venerable university. Seeing his sad face, his mother held his chin up and assured him that even though Takshashila was no more, there were another bigger and better universities waiting for him. The great University of Nalanda in Magad and the University of Vallabhi in Gujarat. At this, Devdatta's face used to lit up into a hopeful grin. But just then, his mother used to warn him. It would not be easy, Devdatta. You would have to study a lot, his mother had said. But I have already studied the 10,000 syllables in 300 Sanskrit shlokas of the Siddha composition, Mom. And this semester we even studied the Sutra of Panini and the Book of Dhatu. His 8-year-old self had told his mom with quite the pride reflecting in his cheeks. His mother had smiled at him. She knew he was a bright kid, but the text that came next would be much tougher. Okay, Deva, now get to sleep fast or you will miss your session tomorrow. She kissed his forehead and blew the lamp. John was born in medieval London in 13th century, about 600 years after Devdatta, to a well-off merchant family. As a child, he was sent to the local grammar school to study the Latin language. John was an average kid who learned a bit slower than his friends, but he was lucky, for he had a rich dad who wanted him to graduate and get a good administrative position in one of the London's famous churches. John was fine with following his dad's wishes, but there was one problem that troubled him every day. His best friend, Patrick, albeit way brighter than him, would not be able to join him to the premier Oxford University when they turned 16. The yearly fees was £5, which was about 2.5 years of his Mason father's pay. John had still not gathered the courage to ask his father if he could help Patrick in the regard. John sighed and decided he would ask his father when it was time. For now, they would enjoy their time together. Devdatta couldn't believe his eyes. After almost a week of travelling down the Uttarapatha, crossing Allahabad and Varanasi on the way, there lay in front of him the majestic gates of the fabled Nalanda University. It was surrounded on all sides by vast shimmering blue pools, 100 meters wide and hundreds of meters long, and reflecting in them was Nalanda itself. Crossing the pools, Devdatta made his way to the gates and nervously glanced at the renowned gatekeepers of the university. They rejected 80% of the candidates, so Devdatta was going to give the toughest entrance exam in the medieval world that day. Currently, they were quizzing and debating a prospective student who had travelled all the way from China. He knew that most of the Chinese students came via the treacherous northern route via Mongolia, Afghanistan and down the Uttarapatha. But this one had taken the southern route via the Straits of Malacca and Burma and landed at Tamralipti before coming here. It was getting hot even though the sun had still not fully arisen. He shuffled his feet and anxiously looked behind. The line of students stretched for miles, the last student diminishing more and more to the size of a crow. Devdatta looked towards the gates again. The morning mists were clearing, and to his surprise, he could make out the three majestic towering structures just beyond the gates of what could only be the nine-story library of Nalanda. His heart rate quickened. He and his friends had debated about the contents of the 90 lakh manuscripts stored there when they were just 14 and started their secondary education. Now, at 20, only he had managed to complete all the necessary disciplines of study, including the study of logic, metaphysics, Tarkashastra, and Jatakamala at the local Kannauj University. Devdatta was already declared a distinguished student, but now he wanted to complete the graduate program of Nalanda and finally get the stamp of culture and refinement. Then he would be known all throughout Bharat and praised in lands abroad as far as Korea, Tibet, China, and Japan for his wisdom. The line moved forward, and Devdatta smiled. The Chinese student now passed the gates into the spacious central courtyard. John and Patrick were on their way to Oxford. Their horses walked side by side, but between them there was a stony silence. None of them knew what to say to each other. It was so unfair. They had been friends for all of 16 years. John had hoped his father would agree to sponsor his best friend, loan him the money until he paid him back. He could still remember his dad laughing soundly when the question had left his throat. His father thought it was a joke. When John didn't laugh back, his father's face suddenly transformed into a stern rock, and he walked off saying, "You think it's easy to earn money, huh?" The best he could do was lend Patrick the money to rent a horse for the day to drop his best friend off. But now the horses came to a halt. Both of them looked ahead, and before them stood the towering spires of churches and turrets of castle keeps. The ground was way muddier here. There was a lot of traffic with armored knights faring on horseback, ragged beggars lining the streets. But what caught their eyes were the young men in dark robes hurrying along the streets, clutching books in their hands and arguing fiercely about something in Latin. John's chest constricted. He looked over at Patrick and quickly saw a drop of tear leaving his eyes. Patrick quickly brushed it away, but John had seen it. This was his dream. Patrick deserved it. He was the top of the class, and yet he would never get the chance. Patrick didn't meet John's eyes. Instead, he trained them to the rows of bookshops, inns, taverns, grocers, and tailor shops lining the streets. He hated his father, but more than that, he disliked Oxford. Behind the towering turrets and glorious colleges, it was but an elite, all-male bastion providing its services selectively to the land-owning professional and merchant classes, the medieval 1%, keeping the rich rich and the poor poor. The only silver lining that John saw was that there was no entrance exam. A bag of £5 in strong Latin was enough to get you inside the prestigious Oxford University. The traffic cleared and their horses trudged forward. Devdatta was still quite jittery after the exam. He had miraculously passed it. The debates were heated, but Devdatta had summoned his knowledge of all of his years of studying, had his arguments ready, and stood his ground. At the end, the gatekeeper looked quite impressed. Before opening the gates, though, he had asked him which subject he would like to study. Devdatta had debated this question for quite a while now. Nalanda offered more than 25 subjects, each with their highly accomplished teachers or pandits. There was the science of poison or Sarpavidya, economics or Arthashastra, arithmetic or Rashi Vidya, Ganita Shastra or mathematics, history and legendary stories or the Itihasa Purana, science of archery or Shastra Vidya, and his throat would be parched by the time he completed the list. Most famous, however, were philosophy, Nyaya Vidya, which was the study of logic, Ayurveda, which was the study of medicine, Grammar, Nakshatra Vidya, which was the study of astronomy, and Vyakhyana, or the art of interpretation and debate. In India, non spiritual knowledge was not considered a hindrance to the spiritual knowledge. Devdatta liked that. But now he had to choose a subject to study. He debated going for Rashi Vidya or Sarpa Vidya, but ultimately settled on Nyaya Vidya, the study of logic. The gatekeeper then gave him directions to the specified college or the Sangrama of logic, where he would study and stay for the next 2 years. Devdatta anxiously exhaled and took his first step inside Nalanda, the land where the great Sariputra, Buddha's wisest disciple, was born and attained nirvana. The air smelled different here. As soon as he entered, he felt a sense of ease pass over him. The energy in this place was so different from any other place he had ever known, as if peace and the thirst for knowledge had made a permanent settlement here. He looked around. On the right, he saw raised meditation platforms filled with monks in yellow robes practicing their daily meditation. To the left, he saw rows upon rows of sangramas or colleges that extended for several kilometers. He could hardly see where they ended from here. All around the place, there were towering turrets and viharas, bustling with scholars and monks, all from different countries, all drawn together to this place like a magnet in search of knowledge. Devdatta was lucky to be born in this magnificent country after all. He now passed several monasteries, some 2 stories high, some 3 stories, until he finally arrived at the Sangrama of Logic. The 3 story building was huge, and just as he arrived at the gate, he bumped into another student. Is this the college for logic? I'm not so good with directions, sorry, the student said. Devdatta looked at him curiously. He didn't look like he belonged to his own caste. In fact, with the way he was dressed, he probably belonged to the... Yes, it is, Devdatta said, but then he added, Are you by any chance a prince? The student trained his eyes towards Devdatta and said, chuckling, Yes, Prince Dhruvasen of Kashmir. And you? Devdatta, a bit overwhelmed, introduced himself, and then they both walked past the 2 dwarpals inside the thick walls of the Sangrama into the central courtyard. Ahead of them both, in the center of the courtyard, there was a raised dais, upon which sat cross-legged who could only be the great Pandit of logic, who was currently answering a question a student had asked. Surrounding him, a bit lower, sat rows of students, Hindus and Buddhists alike. Hindus in their dhotis and uttariyas and Buddhists in their yellow robes. Around the rectangular courtyard, there were rows of thick columns, beautifully carved, behind which were student cells about 30 on each floor. Both Devdatta and the prince took their seats amongst the students and listened to the great Pandit who turned a leaf of the delicate manuscript in front of him. After the lecture, they both made their way to the teacher and introduced themselves. They chatted with him, and then the Pandit looked them straight in the eyes and checked if they knew the rules. Destroying life, stealing, drinking, defaming the Buddha, Dhamma, or the Sangha, holding false dogmas, or misconduct with the nuns would get them thrown out of the university for life, he had told them with a stern face. After they both diligently nodded their heads, he quizzed them both on the various manuscripts of logic, asking questions from a range of books. The prince and Devdatta both managed to impress the Pandit. Finally, the time came. Devdatta asked his teacher, Can I become your student? Silence. Devdatta asked again, Can I become your student? Silence. He asked again, Can I become your student? Finally, the Pandit nodded his head and accepted his request. Formally becoming a student, the Pandit lent him sets of dhotis and uttariya that Devdatta would wear throughout his stay at the college. This was the age-old ritual of a student and a teacher relationship. Nothing surprising, nothing new. The same ritual happened with the prince. Excited, both of them grabbed their belongings and then headed upstairs, smiling, onto the third floor into one of the cells which they would call home for the next 2 years. Unless, of course, they decided to change their subject of study and transfer to another Sangrama. The prince was allocated a room beside Devdatta. Devdatta bid the prince goodbye for the day and excitedly took a look at his own room. It was not huge, a 10 by 10 feet space ideal for a single student, just enough place to fit the mattress, his manuscripts, and belongings. Although the weather was hot, the walls were thick enough to cool down the air. Devdatta dropped his belongings and plopped down on the mattress after a tiring but exciting day. The goodbye had been hard. John had seen Patrick cry unguarded for the first time. He had let himself cry too. But now John sat in his college hall with its high walls and small windows, which he would share with 20 other students for the next 5 years. He would share a room with 4 other students and sleep on bunks with straw mattresses. Privacy didn't exist at Oxford. He had heard even the principal didn't have his own room. Forget about the lowly first years. But now was not the time to complain. He had to rent out the expensive academic books at the bookshops and tailor his brown robes at the shop he had seen on the way and buy a pair of smart black shoes. Managing his stay here would be tough with the precisely counted money his father had given him. Even the food was not free here. He had paid for his midday meal himself and would have to pay for the 6 p.m. supper and the 7 a.m. breakfast as well, each day might he add. John made his way to the bookshop and looked at the list of books handed to him. Grammar, theology, canons, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He handed it over to the shopkeeper, who then got busy finding and assimilating them together. John sucked in a deep breath of air and shivered. Cold gusts of winds were now blowing through the streets. Even the beggars were nowhere in sight now. He would have to study a ton and memorize the pages of all of those books. His gut clenched as his thoughts went to Patrick. Patrick won't be here to help him anymore. John was on his own. Monetarily, socially, academically. He had always craved independence, but now that he had gotten a taste of it, John was not sure he liked the idea very much. No matter what kind of a father John had, at least in London, he enjoyed a sheltered existence with more privacy than he could ever expect here at Oxford, with no stress about the shortage of money. Here you go, lad. The shopkeeper handed him the pile of books, and John handed him 20 cents. His bag of coins was getting very light by the day. Devdatta was woken up by insistent ghantis or bells ringing from every sort of direction he could possibly imagine. He heard doors opening and closing all around him. Devdatta quickly got out of his bed and, to his surprise, the whole courtyard was filled to the brim and was slowly emptying as students made their way out somewhere. Devdatta had no idea what was happening. He heard someone laughing and saw the prince grinning at him. I can pay a lot of money for that look. He was clutching his stomach and laughing heartily. What's happening? Devdatta said, bewildered. The sun was not yet up, but he could see a warm tinge on the horizon. Get ready for your first student bath, Devdatta, and mine too, I suppose. The prince scratched his ears and started down the stairs. Devdatta shut his room door and hurried alongside the prince. Both of them made their way to the lakes behind the Sangramas. They brushed their teeth with toothwood made up of tender branches of neem or babul tree and proceeded to take a dip in the lake. After wearing their new clothes, they proceeded to breakfast area. But they could not have the food until the teachers were finished having theirs. So after waiting for them to finish, all the students were served rice water, their first meal of the day, just after sunrise. Everything in the university was free. Food, clothes, stay. The manuscripts could be borrowed from the library and they could make their own copies of it. The only thing they had to worry about was their studies. And even those were taught in a highly personalized manner. Instead of the teachers lecturing on particular parts of particular subjects, the Pandit paid more attention to the needs of individual students and then shaped the day's discussion, debates, and teachings around it. They would have the lunch a little after 12 o'clock, which included rice, butter, milk, fresh fruits, and sweet melons, which arrived from hundreds surrounding villages of Nalanda. The dinner was served at 7 o'clock, after which the day's activities ended. It said about 4,000 to 10,000 students attended Nalanda each year, 10,000 being quite the stretch. There were about 1500 teachers, which meant 10 to 15 pundits for every 100 students. Excellent student teacher ratio, if you ask me. The head of all pundits and teaching staff was called the Karmadana or the Viharaswami. The head of them all was called the Superior. The most learned pundits used to travel on sedan chairs instead of horseback. On their free days, the pastimes for students were many: horse riding, elephant riding, chariot races, archery, wrestling, boxing with fists, dancing, gambling, although not advised, guessing other people's thoughts, mimicry, swordsmanship, and the list never ended. No exams were taken for graduation because the course would not proceed without holistic understanding from every student. Graduation was linked more to spiritual purposes and not commercial. Students went to universities to become cultured and not just to grab better posts in society. However, the job opportunities once they graduated from Nalanda were endless. Their future was very bright. Some students presented their schemes and showcased political talent in front of kings and assemblies. Many of them got hired into high ranking government ministerial posts in various cities of the country. Others made their debut at the House of Debates, while others became the greatly honored gatekeepers of Nalanda. Some rose to become pundits or professors or the Karmadana of the university. Those who couldn't manage any of these got hired as private tutors to princes or sons of nobles in various medieval kingdoms. Even for John, there were no graduation exams. It was made sure that every student followed each topic before they continued to the next. His job prospects weren't bad either. He could choose for a career with the church or get into church administration. Or if he wanted to continue his studies, he could go for advanced topics like law or physician, after which he could practice law or medicine. All in all, I would say Nalanda managed to become a crucible for cross fertilization of ideas, as it was open to people from all castes, sects, and religions, and importantly, offered free education. Since it connected with the medieval Silk Route, it became a center for the flow of knowledge from the east and west, and became a concentrated location where scholars from far and wide could have intellectual debates and discussions, thereby growing and building upon old and new ideas alike. The decline of Nalanda was the story of the decline of Buddhism in India, as major Buddhist patron dynasties were defeated or wiped out. The end of Nalanda by Bakhtiyar Khilji in 12th century marked the end of an era of almost 800 continuous years of enlightenment in the history of global education. After its decline, there was a shift towards decentralized education systems like Gurukuls, marked by close teacher-student relationships in a secluded setting. Oxford was a part of a new education movement sweeping across Europe, which gave rise to the university model originated in Bologna. These universities were closely tied to the church, and most scholars held clerical status. But over time, reason and logic began to challenge blind faith. Fortunately for Oxford, it was not burned to the ground by barbaric invaders and continued to grow into a premier institute of education that we see today. If you like the video, please do share it with your friends and tell me what topic would you like to see a video on the next time.